Hey guys, Ridiculous Production here. I'm gonna tell you one of my favorite NPCs, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. So if you're traveling to the Southwest or live in the Southwest, here's a interesting story. He was one of the first Europeans to travel into the American Southwest, looking for that sweet, sweet gold. Coronado first heard of the 7 cities of gold through this explorer named Cabeza de Vaca. So let me give you a quick rundown of Cabeza de Vaca. He started out in Florida, things went sideways, and he found himself on the shores of Galveston, Texas, where Native Americans enslaved him for a while until he showed them that he was a mystic. He really had that magic touch. Later finding his way into northern Mexico, where the Spanish found him and eventually brought him back to Mexico City, where he expressed a rumor of a city to the north of great wealth. This is where Coronado comes in. After hearing the story of the 7 cities of gold, he personally funded with government grants the expedition to the north. He eventually landed himself on the border between New Mexico and Arizona, where he met the Zuni's. Interesting name, by the way. Now let's let Skynet take it from here.
The Zuni encounter, the expedition's first major clash with Native Americans, was indeed at the Zuni pueblo of Huica, in present-day New Mexico. By this point, the expedition was starving and desperate for food. The Zuni, who had already heard about the Spaniards' advance and had killed Coronado's scout Estevanico the year before, were not welcoming. The requirimiento. Before the battle, Coronado attempted to perform the traditional Spanish ritual of the requirimiento. This was a formal declaration, read in Spanish, that explained the Catholic Church's and the Spanish Crown's authority over the land and its people. It offered the Native Americans the choice to submit peacefully and convert to Christianity. If they refused, the Spaniards were justified in waging just war against them. As you noted, the Zuni had no way of understanding the Spanish words and instead drew a line of cornmeal on the ground, a traditional Zuni war challenge, which the Spanish ignored. Coronado's injury and the battle, the Zuni responded with a hail of arrows and stones. Coronado was hit by several arrows and a large rock to the head, and was knocked unconscious. His men, seeing their leader fall, rallied around him. One of his captains, Don Garcia Lopez de Cardenas, and another soldier named Hernando de Alvarado, shielded him with their bodies. The Spanish, with their superior armor, horses, and weaponry, eventually overwhelmed the Zuni and took control of the pueblo. Disappointment and anger at the priest, the expedition's jubilation was short-lived. Instead of the golden city described by Fray Marcos de Niza, they found a simple adobe village. The soldiers were furious with Fray Marcos for what they believed were his wild exaggerations and lies. Coronado himself sent Fray Marcos back to Mexico in disgrace shortly after the encounter. This incident highlights the central role that rumor and exaggeration played in motivating these costly and dangerous expeditions.
I don't necessarily buy that Coronado was starving when he reached the Zunis. He literally had a massive herd of cattle, horses, and sheep. But he literally did cross the Sonoran Desert to get there. I also would find it pretty funny that he would read this declaration of war in Spanish. If you were a Zuni warrior, these strange men would read a bunch of nonsense out loud that you couldn't understand, and then they would cry out, "Santiago!" Coronado gets hit in the head with a rock, where he passes out and has like a DMT experience probably. Eventually being saved by his own men, and the Spanish securing their own victory after the Zuni battle, they made their way to the Rio Grande Valley. But first, some of you may not know what a pueblo is, and how giant these things could get. Yeah, I had no idea that a pueblo could have over 1,000 rooms and take over a century to complete. I'm also a huge fan of that aesthetic. Anyway, let's move on to the Rio Grande Valley.
After the disappointing discovery at Huica, Coronado sent out scouting parties to explore the surrounding area. One of these groups, led by Hernando de Alvarado, was tasked with traveling eastward to see what they could find. This is the group that eventually reached the Rio Grande Valley. Here's what happened when they reached the River Valley, which is home to modern-day Albuquerque and Bernalillo. A temporary haven, the expedition found a large cluster of Native American pueblos, known collectively as the Tiguex, pronounced T-Wesh, province. The Rio Grande pueblos were much larger and more numerous than the Zuni villages they had encountered, and they offered a much more suitable place for the entire expedition to spend the winter. Initial hospitality, turning to conflict. Initially, relations were relatively peaceful. The Spaniards, in need of food and supplies for their large army, which included hundreds of Spanish soldiers, thousands of indigenous allies from Mexico, and livestock, were welcomed into the pueblos. The Tiguex people, however, soon found the demands of their uninvited guests to be overwhelming and abusive. The Spanish took over one of the pueblos to use as their main camp, and they began to demand food, clothing, and other goods. The Tiguex War. Tensions escalated dramatically. The Spanish, who were used to the customs of the Aztec Empire where such demands were part of a tribute system, did not understand the Pueblo people's independent and cooperative social structure. The situation became violent after a Spanish soldier allegedly assaulted a Pueblo woman and the Spanish authorities refused to punish him. The Tiguex people retaliated by killing some Spanish livestock. This led to a series of brutal attacks and retaliatory actions. Coronado's army besieged and conquered several pueblos, including one where they executed over 200 Native Americans. The first Spanish headquarters. The main expedition established its headquarters in one of the Tiguex pueblos, possibly Chihuahua Pueblo, which is now a historic site near Bernalillo, New Mexico. They stayed there for the winter of 1540 to 1541. It was during this time that they heard stories about a new, even richer land to the east from an enslaved Native American they called the Turk. This new hope for gold would lead them out of the Rio Grande Valley and onto the Great Plains the following spring.
So the T-Wesh province of modern-day Albuquerque was essentially the largest population of Native Americans in the Southwest. Now let's discuss the inevitable T-Wesh War. On one occasion, a Spaniard sexually assaulted a Native American woman. Her husband brought this to Coronado, which asked him to point out the man responsible for the attack. The man couldn't recognize him, so the matter was dropped, which later escalated tensions, obviously. Also, the Spanish brought livestock with them. Native Americans in the Southwest have never seen a horse, a cow, or a sheep, for that matter. And in turn, the Spaniards have never seen a turkey or also jaguars that would make their way up north. The only thing Native Americans could compare a horse to was a deer. They also thought that horses would eat you. But in my opinion, one of the biggest problems was the cattle that would roam free and demolish literally all of their crops. And in turn, the Spanish would ask the natives for even more food that their cattle literally just destroyed. So these escalating tensions led to war, which was straight up like a Mad Max style warfare. That's why I'm obsessed with Wild West history, Native American culture, because it was straight up Mad Max. Literally the closest thing to history that we have to it.
The Turks' story in Quivira. While the expedition was encamped for the winter in the Rio Grande Valley, Coronado met the Turk, who had been acquired from the Pecos Pueblo. The Turk had a striking physical appearance and a compelling story. He claimed to have fled a city to the east called Quivira, where a great king lived. He described a place of incredible wealth, exaggerating the details to please the gold-hungry Spaniards. His stories included a river that was 2 leagues wide, the king of Quivira sleeping under a tree with gold bells hanging from it, gold plates and jewels in abundance, boats on the river with great sails, Coronado's frustration and renewed hope. Coronado's frustration was indeed at an all-time high. After spending over a year and a significant personal fortune on the expedition, he had found nothing but adobe villages and angry natives. The failure at Zuni and the subsequent violent conflict in the Rio Grande Valley had been a profound disappointment. The morale of his men was low, and many were questioning the very existence of the fabled golden cities. However, the Turks' story presented a new possibility. The prospect of Quivira was a last-ditch effort to save the expedition from being a complete failure. While Coronado likely had some suspicion, the desire for wealth and the need to justify the immense cost of the venture were powerful motivators. He chose to believe the Turk because the alternative was to admit defeat and return to Mexico empty-handed and disgraced. The lure of Quivira was enough to convince Coronado to split his army. He took a smaller, more mobile force, including the Turk, as their guide, and headed east across the vast and unfamiliar Great Plains. The rest of the expedition remained in the Rio Grande Valley, waiting for a signal to follow. This decision marked a major turning point, leading the expedition far from the familiar lands of the Southwest and deep into the center of the continent.
I also find it fascinating that they were looking for El Dorado in Texas and later Kansas. They also encountered bison, which they called cows. Also, the fascinating part is when they were passing through Texas on their horses, some 200 years later, the mighty Comanche Empire would be hunting them on their horses. So that's why I love the Southwest and these connections to the Southwest and the Wild West. They also described the Great Plains as an ocean of grass.
The discovery of Quivira and the aftermath. The Turk eventually led Coronado and his small, desperate band to a settlement, not of gold and riches, but a simple village of grass huts. This was Quivira, a community of the Wichita people located in present-day central Kansas. The king was a chief who lived in a simple hut, and the gold plates were actually a small, polished copper plate found on the neck of a local man, likely a trading good. The Spanish found no gold, silver, or other valuables. It was at this moment that Coronado realized the full extent of the deception. The entire expedition had been a failure, and the Turks' stories were a fabrication. In a rage, and with the full support of his frustrated men, Coronado ordered the Turk to be executed. He was garroted, strangled with a cord, and his body was left behind as the Spanish prepared for their return journey. Coronado's ultimate discovery at Quivira was not a city of gold, but rather a final, devastating blow to his dream. Having finally accepted the reality of his failure, he led his men back to the main army, which was still waiting in the Rio Grande Valley. The expedition spent one more brutal winter there before finally beginning the long, slow, and disgraced journey back to Mexico City in 1542, leaving a legacy of disappointment and conflict in its wake.
But honestly, the Turk got off a little easy, because there are accounts that the Spanish would tie your body up and have 4 horses rip it apart. He eventually made his way back to modern-day Albuquerque and had to make his sad march back to Mexico City to report what he found. So yeah, eventually Coronado died in poverty, a shadow of his former self, at the age of 42. And that's the interesting story of one of my favorite NPCs. So if you're ever in the Southwest, remember the story of Coronado. My name is Ridiculous Production, tuning out.